days I teach at AB Tech in the morning in Asheville, head over to East Asheville, teach a few classes at Warren Wilson College, and then I come out here and host a jazz night at Southern Appalachian Brewery.
How did you get started in music? How old were you?
I was about 7 years old, and my dad played a bunch of instruments. He played guitar and piano and bass guitar and things like that. And, you know, when he was growing up, he studied classical piano, but he really liked rock and roll. He thought it was really important that I learn how to play piano. I remember not liking it at that age. I remember thinking, you know, I don't want to do this. I'm not sure I'll be doing something else. So I kind of did it begrudgingly for a little bit while I was younger, and just kind of on and off played, but didn't really seriously study it. And then when I was about probably 12 or 13, I started to get a little more into it and started to actually write some stuff, you know. And I didn't know a lot about music, and I wasn't a very good student in the sense that I wouldn't practice stuff other people gave me. But I like to just noodle around and make up stuff.
And you started out with the piano?
Yeah.
Now, how long did you play the piano before you went to another instrument?
That's a good question. Well, from I guess 7 to 12 to about 13, I guess about 6 or 7 years, because when I was about 13 or 14, I forget when exactly, I began to play some drum set too. And again, it was my dad showed me some stuff he learned, and I just kind of messed around. It wasn't very serious at first. It was more of a hobby and just kind of feeling things through. And then it was about, I think, 15 or so, I went to Canon Music Camp up at Appalachian State University. And this has been around since the 60s. It's a great music camp up there through the university music program. And I remember going there and just being totally unprepared and thinking, well, you know, I don't really know what I'm doing, just kind of diving in the deep end. And I played piano and percussion while I was there. And that's where I discovered all the other percussion instruments, heard a lot of classical music, you know, played with an orchestra for the first time, played with a wind ensemble for the first time. I could barely read music. It was a very kind of dive in the deep end and good luck kind of experience. They had a need for percussionists, and so I sent an audition tape of me playing keyboard, and I forget what I played on the audition tape for drum set. I don't think it was very good, but I think they were just so in need of percussion that they accepted me. I think I was one of those students who was like one of the last ones they probably accepted, just because they wanted higher enrollment.
Someone.
Exactly. So it worked out, and my eyes were opened. And yeah, from that point forward, I really began to study percussion and piano more seriously. And within a few years, I think it was that moment, my last few years of high school, I said, I really need to practice. I really need to take this seriously. Because, you know, a lot of people that age in high school when you're a teenager, if you don't have a hobby or something to really motivate you,
yes,
you just kind of wander and you don't really take anything seriously. And I didn't really take much seriously. I was a good student. I did my work and I enjoyed reading, but kind of just aimlessly wandering. And then the music came in, and it really gave me this sense of, this is something I'm really serious about. And I just dedicated myself to hours and hours of practice each day. And within a few years, was able to, for the most part, catch up on some deficits, I think, that I had in terms of my technique and training and all that.
Did you determine the deficits, or did someone else?
When I went to this camp, someone there determined the deficits. A lot of people did, in fact. I remember one time, you know, my dad just said, you know, if I hear a song, I can sit down and I can just figure it out. I don't have to really think about it. So
wonderful. He's a talented man.
He is, yeah. And my mother was a musician too. She doesn't play anymore, but she was a concertmaster in her high school orchestra and played mandolin as well. Not Appalachian mandolin. She lived in New York City in an Italian neighborhood.
What other instruments do you play?
My main instrument, I would say, is vibraphone, and that's what most people know me for. But I also play piano and drums and a lot of different percussion instruments.
Yes, I love the way you play that.
Thank you.
I've been watching you. Your hands are all over the place. And then when you played the piano last week, I was amazed. I hadn't seen you play the piano before.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, it's funny because they're very similar in some ways. They're both the same layout, like visually.
Yes.
But the technique is so different. I have a lot of people say, oh, you play piano, so you must be able to play vibraphone, and or vice versa. And it's very different because with piano, everything's digital. You're thinking about what each finger is doing. And vibraphone is more wrist and arm.
Yes.
So two very different things.
Do you have a choice, a preference?
I really like both. I think it depends on the genre of music and the sound I'm looking for. I think, because I'll play both. And I think one of the things too is in that moment, who are the other musicians I'm playing with, right? So a big part of it may be what are the other instruments in the room. One thing I've noticed living in West North Carolina is not just in Asheville, obviously Asheville gets a lot of recognition, but also in places like Hendersonville and Brevard, there's a lot of people involved in different mediums of the arts. And there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for cross-pollination of those mediums, right? So painters working with musicians. One thing I try to have on jazz night, for example, whenever I can. It's something I haven't really done as much at SAB. I've done it a couple of times. Tara did one, actually.
Yes, I remember.
It's the live painting. And so the idea of...
And you used that painting for your cup, didn't you?
That's right. So a guitarist, Dan Keller, recorded an album with him. And I asked Tara to do the artwork. I was like, can you do the artwork? And I think one of the things about an arts community is everybody trying to help each other out. Artists, I think, in any medium, whether it's a painter or a writer or a poet or a musician or a dancer or a screenwriter or an actor, it doesn't matter what the medium is, the idea of expressing oneself.
I convinced Tara to take my screenwriting class.
Oh, cool, yeah.
It was so funny. It was almost like pulling teeth because she says, Noel, I'm not a literal person, I'm visual, which I know, she's very visual. But her screenplay is 85% visual. And it tells the story so beautifully that you can just take the camera and follow it with very, very little dialogue. And she's enjoying it, so I'm really
That's
excited
wonderful.
about that.
Well, film is such a visual medium.
Another student in the class who's quite interesting. The first night I told her to give me 25 characteristics of her main character.
Oh, wow.
So, because that's, usual. You have to feel the character, you've got to walk with the character. You know
Personalize it.
Personalize it.
Yeah.
So she came up to my desk and said, I'm autistic and I cannot imagine. And I offered her an option. I said, okay, since you have this idea, why don't you just write it as a novel? And then later we'll deconstruct it into a screenplay. And she says, no, I see it as a film.
Well, people know what they want, I think, They see it and they can imagine it.
But to have a disability that's
Sure.
crucial in your art, and then you insist upon doing it, it's really remarkable.
It is, and it might even be that, yes, it's a disability, but I think it's also maybe a different perspective to have that lens of, being somebody on the spectrum, being autistic, and having a lens that maybe is different from the lens of people who don't have that perspective.
Yes, art does have a purpose.
Well, I think that art serves multiple purposes. And that's one of the things that always intrigues me is that everybody, I think, art is something that's part of every human culture, right? It's a part of the human condition. Every culture has art. And I think what's interesting is that art can serve so many different purposes, so many different functions and purposes. For some people, it provides escape. Some people, it provides relief. Some people, it provides intellectual stimulation. There's so many things, I think, that art can do.
I agree.
So it's powerful.
Have you ever had a moment or a period in your life whereby you were disappointed in what you're doing?
Oh, yeah, sure. I think, that still happens, It's one of those things where, as an artist, I'm hard-pressed to think of any artists I know who aren't, when they create something, maybe self-critical of it, or say, that could have been better, or I could have done that better, or something like that. I think I used to be more self-critical, and I think I used to be more easily disappointed in something. And I think now, one of the things I've learned to recognize is that the most important aspect, for me at least as an artist, is not the end result, but the process. And that was something that was always, I think, what drew me to the art. You know, if I wasn't performing, I'd still be playing music. You know, it's not something, and you know this as an artist,
Yes.
you can't just shut it off,
No.
right? And we don't do it necessarily because we're thinking about what's the end goal. We enjoy the act of doing it, right? Somebody, I forget who it was, I was reading this somewhere, somebody told me, they said, if I told you that your career is going to involve you spending hours and hours alone in a room working towards doing one thing extremely well, and that it may not be successful the one or two times you do it, what would you say? And most people said, oh, that's crazy. I said, but if you think about it, that's what a lot of artists do, right? Whether you're working on a film, you spend months, you know, working towards this one thing that maybe you get one shot at, a play.
Sometimes years.
Years, absolutely. And so I think one of the things I tell to my students is you have to enjoy the process. That's really the most important part. Because if you don't enjoy that process, that journey, and you're just fixated on that end goal, and it's good to have an end goal and have a clear vision, but don't ignore all the stuff that might happen along the way, because that's as much a part of it.
It is a much a part of it. Yes, indeed, because for everything you do, you learn something.
Yeah, yeah.
And it might not be what you were seeking, but it'll be something that might lead you to what you were seeking, and you just keep on and keep on.
Like an accidental discovery, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to me, that's, I think, one of the things I like about jazz as an art form, or any style of improvisation, is by its very nature, any act of improvisation in music or dance or acting or whatever it might be, you make those accidental discoveries sometimes. And you discover things about your own playing, or how you play with other people, or even just the sounds you create, or the melodies you create, or even the mood you create on a more intangible level that you may not have discovered before.
It was Heidi Mayfield who started me to painting, because I came here as a photographer.
Oh, cool.
And I was at Heidi's gallery, and she was painting on the floor.
Yeah.
I mean, I had never seen anyone with a canvas on the floor painting. Well, I said to her, I said, gee, I wish I knew how to paint. She says, but you can. I said, no, I can't. I'm a photographer, I don't know how to paint. She encouraged me, so I took her first class. She says, Noel, just let your inner self out. They were truly abstract portraits.
That's your vision.
And I don't know if it was my vision or if it was just the hand going across the canvas.
That's true, but I feel like it's all connected, no? It's not like this mind-body dualism. It's all integrated. I think that's one of actually the cool things about art, whatever the medium might be, is yes, there's a cerebral component, but there's also this very kinesthetic, I'm going to do something component, right?
Yes.
And how they merge, we might not even be aware of it. One of the interesting things is, as a photographer, you already bring an understanding of things visually to the table. You can see a composition, you can see perspective, you can see things that somebody who's not a photographer like me coming into a painting class wouldn't see. So you bring in all these other perspectives that can really inform what you're doing as a painter that I would be absolutely clueless about. Sometimes working in a different medium, so like photographers who also do painting, their painting might inform their photography in some way, or vice versa.
Yes.
There's some crossover. Did that happen with you when you...
No, having been a screenwriter for many years, when I'm painting, I think more of a movie.
Yeah.
In
Like a story.
a story.
It's more like movement across the
Movement
canvas.
across the- How do you see yourself in 5 years?
I honestly have no idea. I mean, I hope I'm lucky enough to continue doing what I'm doing right now. And, I think, I think about all the people I know in my life who are artists. And by artist, I mean that in a very broad sense, the definition. Anybody who is expressing themselves through a creative medium. That's how I think of an artist. It doesn't necessarily need to be somebody's doing it professionally. It could be anybody from a hobbyist to a professional. And for me, I'm very fortunate in that this thing that I've spent years studying and think about a lot is something that I am able to make a living at. That's a really fortunate thing. So, right now, honestly, I'm loving where I'm at. If I can continue to have the privilege and the opportunity to just keep making music and teaching music and learning more about music and be able to survive while doing that.
Now, who are your students?
The students I teach really run the gamut. At AB Tech, a lot of the students I have will be either people in the music pathway who are looking to study music and then transfer to a four-year university for continued studies and possibly grad school beyond that. So there's those students, and like I teach music theory to them, which is like the nuts and bolts, right? So all the stuff like counterpoint and chords and harmony and scales and all that sometimes was considered very dry stuff,
Yes.
right? It's the technique, right? Just like the painter would have a certain technique or the photographer would have a certain technique. But then I have students who aren't going to make a career in music or pursue music on a deeper level. And they just want to understand music better, and they want to learn more about music. Those are music appreciation students, students who take my Intro to Jazz course. And I really enjoy teaching those students because one of the big challenges is how do you communicate music without using the language of music, without using musical terminology? One of the cool things I found is that music by itself can say a lot, even if you don't know the language, even if you don't know the terminology.
True, yes, because you can play a certain, on a piano, certain piece that brings drama.
Yes.
Whereas on the other hand, it could be whimsical, it could be fun.
Right.
It could be poetic.
Totally. I had a composition teacher once who said, okay, I want you, and this is in the context when we think about music, a lot of musical pieces, let's say instrumental music without specific lyrics or vocals, communicates, lament, sadness, joy, triumph. Those are pretty common things, but what if somebody said, okay, I want you to musically communicate hunger? Like, how do you musically communicate like a feeling like that, right?
Slowly,
Right.
slowly, like you're on your last piece of bread.
That's right, exactly. And so using the music appreciation class, those students as an example, I like to get people to think about music in that way. And I think one of the interesting things about the arts that's so cool is that you can think about the arts in so many ways, even if you don't have the technical jargon for it.
Yes.
Right? I think the other cool thing about the arts, John Dewey, who's a great American educator, late 19th, early 20th century, and one of the things he said about art is there is no final term in the appreciation of art, essentially meaning that you can look at the same painting your whole life and find something new to discover about it. You and I could be listening to the same piece of music and experience completely different things. Even though we're in the same room, in the same time and space, we're going to bring our own thing to it and have some new insight about it.
Indeed, indeed.
And I think that's really cool. That's something powerful, I think, about art, is that it can be a way also, in that sense, to foster dialogue. It can be a way to connect people. It can make a way or provide a means for people to communicate how they're feeling. I think it's very powerful.
Pat Williams had hundreds of donors.
She speaks to people.
It's like my mama used
And I
to
think
say,
when she sings, there's a
just a
directness
small town boy
in what she does. And I think
living
it's
in
like
a
a story.
lonely
She's a
world.
storyteller. She doesn't just sing a
took the
song.
midnight
She's
train
telling stories.
going anywhere.
And maybe one purpose of art is
Don't stop
help
believing.
people remember the stories they've heard 1,000 times, but they can hear it in a new way. One of the things that always really impresses me about Western North Carolina as a region is the abundance of creativity. I mean, it's outstanding when you think about it. When you think about how many people who are so creatively minded and so skilled live in this area. But there's another thing I'd like to add to that, which is, I say this to anybody in the music community as well as the artistic community, but particularly my experience as a musician, which is it can be a very competitive field. There's a lot of rejection, there's a lot of backstabbing, there's a lot of hurt, things like that. But I don't see that here in West North Carolina. And that's something to really treasure. I'm grateful because there's so many musicians who support one another.
Indeed.
And I try to do that whenever I can. And I see so many musicians who also really try to do that. If anybody is going to understand and appreciate and support the arts, it's going to be an artist.
Black is the color of my true